After failing at game dev for way too long, I decided it was time to better understand what actually makes for successful game design. In this video, I'll provide my thoughts on all the different advice out there, what I think tends to be counterproductive and detrimental, and try to come up with what I think is the closest thing to an objective framework to repeatably design games that have a tight scope and good marketability. By the way, if you want a summary of my thoughts on game dev strategy, I have a free PDF you can grab below. So the first of these is going to be to avoid a common trap that a lot of us fall into that comes from an overemphasis on marketing-driven development, which becomes ultimately counterproductive. Marketing is crucial, but misunderstood. Marketing advice is as varied as the amount of games that exist, and they often come from the particular strategies and tips derived from one indie studio's personal experiences. Taking them as rules of thumb just lead to confusion. First of all, most of us will agree that your game needs to either stand out or be of exceptionally high quality. A few years ago, some GDC talks started to come out which were genuinely very insightful, where devs talked about how their game stood out using hooks. Since then, everybody started to say your game needs a hook, but I think more and more people are realizing the many problems with hooks as they are understood by the broad indie dev community. For example, pretty much everybody who is serious about game dev understands that mixing two different genres is a bad idea. For example, it's a visual novel, but it's also a horror game. In case you're out of the loop, basically it's a roll of the dice whether or not this will work. The audiences of both genres might be very different groups, or you might end up with a diluted version of both genres that no one likes. Also, a hook doesn't imply appeal. Chris made the point recently that a few years ago, these kinds of ironic games worked not because they appealed to the Steam player base, but to social media audiences. If you could show a funny GIF on Twitter, you could get tons of retweets and press attention, but that strategy is waning. And it's also unreliable. Your game doesn't make money based on how many Twitter or Reddit users think it's literally me. It makes money because Steam players find value and joy and depth in playing your game. This is the exact same problem as forcing your game to have some kind of unique hook. Don't get me wrong, making your game unique is fundamental to its success, but that's kind of the problem. It's fundamental. It's not something you can tack on as a gimmick. Most people misunderstand what a hook is. And I'm not even talking about people who think it's like, my game's an RPG, but here's the catch, you play as an edgy anti-hero. No, I'm talking about the idea of taking some well-known genre and adding a weird, unexpected mechanic, like it's a first-person shooter, but you can only shoot straight up. Again, sometimes this works great, but it's a roll of the dice. How do you systematically, predictably know if your hook is actually a hook? You don't. Before we continue, I'd like to thank our sponsor, LucidLink. LucidLink is a cloud storage and file sharing platform perfect for indie game developers working either alone or in a team. The way LucidLink works is that even though it is a remote storage system, it acts as a local drive, meaning when you stream your files through LucidLink, you don't actually need to download any of the files or update anything to see the changes locally. When you make changes to your files stored in your LucidLink workspace, those changes occur in real time. As someone who travels a lot, this is perfect because since I can't bring my desktop with me, instead of copying my game projects to a flash drive, I can upload them to LucidLink and work on my game from my laptop or any other remote device without even needing to download the game files to that device. If you don't have multiple devices and work alone, LucidLink is also a great way to store backups of your game files externally instead of taking up additional space on your hard drive. If you want to work on the files without an internet connection, you can do that too by simply pinning those files, and you'll always have access to them. Check out LucidLink in the description, and a huge thanks to LucidLink for sponsoring this video. So the whole idea of hooks has never been something that I personally ever wanted to focus my games around, and it made me realize that I was going about the design of my own games completely wrong. But the more I look into it, the more it turns out that there are much more secure ways of increasing player satisfaction with your game, which in turn impacts its success, that don't rely on gimmicks. We can appeal to what is more fundamental to what people actually want when they play games. Gavin Eisenbeiss, the creator of Cuffbust and Choo Choo Charles, analyzed the retention data of playthroughs of different games, and it's a great analysis, but there's a major caveat. First of all, certain gameplay features can be much more fun and enjoyable to play than they are to watch. Second of all, in his interview with Jonas Tyroller, Gavin distinguishes his method from the Steam algorithm strategy promoted by guys like Chris Sakowski. But there's still a great deal of value in keeping this stuff in mind. I'll refer you to those videos for more information, but the summary is that he suggests your game should immediately establish a clear, exciting conflict, avoid lots of text, long kill screens, backtracking, and combat against grunt enemies, and would benefit from having chase sequences and boss fights. On the flip side, a player watching a streamer also has to want to do the thing that the streamer is doing, not just to watch it. He has to be able to play the same game with his own unique experience that guarantees continued novelty. In other words, the game needs replayability. The most obvious example of games that suffer from this are linear story games, but they're not the only examples. Discovery and exploration will lose their intrigue too, and seeing the answer to every puzzle in a game will basically suck all the joy out of any puzzle game. Instead, relying on procedural generation and highly system-based simulator style games work really well for both the YouTube algorithm and for the Steam algorithm, which coincides coincidentally aligns perfectly with Chris Sikowski's recommendations of making what he calls crafty buildy simulation-y games. Okay, but enough about streaming. These are all great things to keep in mind, but they won't apply to every game. So what other principles should we use to come up with better game design? Well, to answer this, I'm going to tell you about someone you probably never heard of before. Alex McCrease. Alex is one of the smartest game developers out there, but his work is primarily focused on tabletop games. The thing is, his books on the design pillars he uses for his games made me realize something very important about video game design. Alex talks about a concept called the agency theory of fun. Basically, this theory states that an activity is more fulfilling the more you are able to make use of genuine agency. In other words, the more your actions have real consequences, positive or negative. For both tabletop and video games, this ultimately means that the more real your actions are and the more consequential your moment-to-moment decisions are, the more fulfilling and valuable you will find your time spent playing that game, and the more you will want to engage with it. To interpret this concept in the simplest way possible would be to say, okay, so I add dialogue options and multiple endings to my story game, or I add destructible environments. But those are the most minimal examples of agency, and they're also overused to the point that I don't think they offer anything meaningful. When you break crates to get more coins, okay, great, you broke the crate, but it doesn't matter because nothing else about the game changes. You didn't permanently close a path or open a new one or send shrapnel flying towards your enemies. We need to think about how agency can be the core of what our games are actually about. In a story game, so many things happen outside the player's control, like the layout of the level or the spawns of enemies or even the sentence structure of the dialogue options to choose from. Real agency happens when you can leave some permanent effect on the world. For example, crafting and simulation games where you can build anything you can imagine only to have it destroyed by predictable disasters and misfortunes, and successfully defending against those misfortunes are far more satisfying and fulfilling than games that have you follow a pre-built path. You're essentially treating the game like an art form where your art can be destroyed by the very same medium you used to build the art in the first place. What about if your game isn't a crafting or building game? Well, you might actually have an opportunity to let your players create something even more real than crafting games do. My favorite example of this is the first tree, where you could write your own message that another player would see at the end of their run, knowing it was written by another real player. The game is digital, but what you can build in Minecraft can be deleted outside of the game itself. But the message you receive from someone else who played the game before you is something that someone put thought into writing intentionally that might have a profound effect on you when you come across it. This just scratches the surface, so I'd love to see more games that allow players to have a real impact on each other. I think there's some untapped potential there. But if all that doesn't have much to do with the game that you want to make and you just want to design a good core mechanic, then a principle that will always help you take advantage of the agency theory of fun is to provide your players with the ability to constantly make consequential decisions. Jonas Tyroller did some awesome videos about this a few years ago, and I feel like people haven't been talking about this concept enough recently, but basically the idea is if the player can choose between going one of two directions or making use of one of two mechanics, the choice should have a risk and a reward, or a positive and a potential drawback, and be something that the player can to some extent predict, or at least the risk the player is taking needs to be clearly understood. The examples Jonas uses are a game where you can walk in different directions and gain different points depending on where you go, but you risk having to cross areas that will deal damage, or you can make use of a low damage weapon that slows you down a little, or a high damage weapon that slows you down a lot. Now, when you design your game, it's not enough to just have good decisions and remove mechanics that will create boredom. Your game also needs strong conceptual appeal. That is, if your game idea sucks or doesn't serve the Steam market, the time and effort you spend on your game's design will all be for nothing. To make sure you nail your game's core idea, watch this video next to understand how to take what you're passionate about and transform it into a game that Steam players will be naturally attracted to, so that your marketing is super easy and your game is actually what they want. Remember to grab that PDF below, and thanks for watching, and God bless.